Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're gonna be reviewing the album Deconstruction by Devin Townsend Project. Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog. Now, don't go butchering me down in the comment section. Yes, I know that this is just a Devin Townsend album that is called the Devin Townsend Project album, and there's a reason for it, and I'm gonna detail it afterwards, but I think that when being politically correct, the right artist that made this album was in fact the Devin Townsend Project, because this is what Townsend himself said. So yeah, that's just the thing, I guess. Anyway, he enjoyed some of my favorite bits from this album. Whether you like his style or not, one cannot argue with the importance of Devin Townsend in the prog scene, and of course especially in the progressive metal scene. He has been there for so long, since he first worked with like Steve Vai back in 1993, where he really broke out in some popular scenes, if you might call that, and since then he's been an active voice advocating for progression in the prog scene itself, especially in progressive metal, and that's just something that I have so much appreciation towards. And this year on the series, we've actually already taken a look of one of Devin Townsend's projects, which was my first time encountering any of his works, and that was no other than Teria, his 2001 album, which I believe to be his fourth studio album, considered by many to be his greatest work to date. Now, as the time progressed since 2001 when he created that album all the way up until 2007, behind the scenes, Townsend was digging himself a big hole, which was basically his dependency on alcohol and drug use for writing his music. And well, by the time that his 2007 album came out, he was already pretty much dependent on writing music only while under the influences of drugs or alcohol. And this album that came out in 2007 is actually Ziltoid the Omniscient, which quite ironically is also considered to be one of his greatest albums to date by his fan base, but as he mentioned in the past, that album was definitely written when he was highly dependent of needing these substances to create his music. But after releasing Ziltoid, Townsend understood that he had to make a change in his life, so he decided to take a self-imposed hiatus from the music industry and start focusing on himself, and this time he also produced several albums, which is something that he reflected upon mostly finding pretty unsatisfying, and he didn't like doing that, but instead he went on this own personal journey of trying to get himself back on his feet and being able to write music not under the influence. And well, one of the major changes that he made in his life back in that time was getting rid of his signature hairstyle. Yes, he went from having this flowing golden brown hair to just cutting it all off, shaving his head and becoming bald, and thus basically cementing himself as a new person with a new look, which was reformed and abstained from all these drugs and alcohol, and he could write music without it. And well, after doing so in 2007, now abstained from drugs and alcohol, Townsend realized that he was really having a hard time creating music, so he decided to do the most straightforward thing and just go ahead, pick up the guitar, and write whatever. And well, in the course of the next following 2 years, Devin Townsend would write around about like 60 entire pieces on his own, which he would later want to use in his own works. Now, the 60 songs that he wrote were actually pretty well fitted into 4 neat categories, mostly of styles and moods. And well, Townsend realized that he could use these 4 categories to create 4 separate albums, but he did not really feel like just releasing them under his own moniker, so he instead wanted to call the 4 releases as being released under the Devin Townsend Project. And as I said in the beginning, fool you not, Devin Townsend Project is just Devin Townsend. He's releasing these 4 albums that he came up with under that moniker. But with that being said, he also sees a lot of guest musicians alongside him as well, which is something that was known to not be that much of a trend, at least like around 2007, when he would create most of his music just simply alone by himself. But on these 4 albums we see a lot of contributions, and I think that it all culminates with today's album, Deconstruction, having so many contributing people to it. But firstly, he released his first of 4 albums in 2009, and that one would be called Kai or Key. I'm not entirely sure, it's written K-I, and that one was very much a different album from anything he's done before. A very mellow, a very quiet and somber album, which would actually be contrasted later on in that same year when he would release the second follow-up album called Addicted, coming right back into the progressive metal scene with a harsh sound of it. Now moving on a year forward, in a spur of creation, the Devin Townsend Project will actually release 2 of the following albums on the same day at the same time, that day being of course the 21st of June 2010, when he would release both Deconstruction and an album called Ghost. Now Ghost would be described by Townsend himself as being probably his most mellowest and prettiest record he has done to that time. But as I said, of course, there's always a contrast, and with Deconstruction it would come back right into the extreme metal sound, with this one actually having pretty much the similarity to a characteristic that I already detailed when I did the Terria video, and that is the infamous wall of sound. Now, if you don't know what the wall of sound means, it's something of a term that I actually detailed about in the last video, and a lot of Devin Townsend fans seems to use it when describing the music of Devin Townsend. The wall of sound basically is what it sounds. When you have a piece of music, you're always gonna have gaps between the notes, the instruments, the vocals, the whatever, and these gaps can lead to some really subtle quiet parts. But when it comes to the music of Townsend, well, he just doesn't really let those quiet parts seep in. There's so many layers of instruments and vocals and whatnot that it just creates this wall of sound, which is honestly quite overwhelming. Now, I'm saying that this one is overwhelming because it is to me at times, but I do believe that Devin Townsend fans probably really love this sort of aesthetic, and I totally get that. But when it comes down to it, I gave this album almost the same treatment as I gave Terria, and that's listening to it in 2 separate listening sessions. So I started listening to this one at a certain day, and then I stopped in the middle, went on to sleep, and listened to the rest of it and the next day, because I honestly just couldn't keep up with all that was going on in one single sitting. Now, what I'm about to say right now is something that I don't want you to take lightly, okay? Because what I think of this album is that the use of vocalization, using vocals on this album, is probably the most superb way that I've ever heard vocals being utilized on an album. Ever, okay? I'm not saying this lightly, but this album and the vocals on it is just something completely else than anything that I've ever heard. Now, if you know me and you usually pay attention to the little details, you'd usually notice that whenever I play the favorite bits from an album, there's sometimes, or oftentimes even, considerably more instrumental than vocal. And well, that's just my personal preference. I like instrumental music even in very vocalized albums. But when it came down to this album today, I actually put a bunch of vocal parts in this one because the vocals they're just great, they're ecstatic, and they're really well utilized, and I couldn't help but not noticing that. And as I hinted at earlier, yes, this album has a lot of contributors, and most of them actually are on vocals, and I'm gonna just count off a few that I remember from this album, but honestly there's so much more. So we have Paul Kor from November's Doom, and we also have Mikael Åkerfeldt from Opeth, as well as Tony Giles Rogers from Between the Buried and Me, as well as Fredrik Tordenthal from Meshuggah, and Floor Jensen from Nightwish, alongside so many other vocalists that you probably know from various progressive metal bands. And if you're mostly like me and you're one of those people that thinks that progressive metal vocals basically start and end with growls, well, I just have to suggest that you give this album a spin, because there's so many vocal techniques used on here that I honestly just don't know what their names are. I don't know how to describe them, but they're so superb. We have the standalone vocals, we have the soft vocals, we have the choir, we have the growling, we have the screeching, we have the yelling, the howling, the whatever, all of them used in conundrum with one another. And yeah, I know it's an odd way of describing it, but it feels like a cacophony, but it's a very well orchestrated one. And with speaking of the vocals, I didn't even mention the fact that this was in fact a concept album. Yes, this is not an avant-garde prog metal album that just goes in every direction and doesn't have a meaning to it. This is in fact a concept album, and it talks of a man that is looking for like the reason for reality and nature. He's basically looking to deconstruct existence itself, and then he just kind of goes into hell and he meets the devil, and the devil gives him a cheeseburger, and he says that he cannot eat it because he's vegetarian, thus he's being unable to realize the full potential of reality itself. Which is really odd, but in another sense it's pretty cool. I must admit that I wasn't really following the concept all the way along, but I must also say that it is pretty much a neat one and a very dystopian as well. Now this concept actually culminates in my personal favorite track from the album, being the title track called Deconstruction, which, despite the fact that it has some really convincing farting and burping noises, to the point where I think they were actually recorded from real life instances, it's a really good one. It just takes everything that's good about this album, puts it in one place, and it creates this masterful track, which to me was a surprise because, well, I already thought that I knew what my personal favorite from the album was supposed to be, and that was The Mighty Masturbator. Awesome track, but just a bit too long for my taste. Other great songs from the album have to include Jeweler, which I personally really like. Now I think that the best description for it would be some sort of a Christmassy horror, post-metal, extreme death, black metal soundtrack film, something. I don't know, it's really good. It makes excellent use of the choir, and honestly it would also be one of my favorites from the album, as well as Planet of the Apes, which is not really one of my personal favorites, but I do have to objectively agree that when it comes to vocal performance, it's just the best one on the album. And honestly, coming back a bit to The Mighty Masturbator yet again, I just thought of this right now, I would actually describe this one as being the modern incarnation of a track like Carnival 9 from ELP. Now overall, when looking at this album, I have to say that I also did compare it to Terria. Now Terria is a very earth-aware song. It talks about global warming and stuff like that, and while I do love the message, I don't think that the album is quite as concise as this one. When this one just started playing, I was really blown away by it. Now that being said, it is a lot on the objective level as well, because subjectively I must admit I gave most songs on this album a rating of 7 because, well, it's not really my type of music, but when I think of this album as a whole, it really is a magnum opus. I really don't see how you can outdo yourself after creating something like this, and personally I am really jealous of Devin Townsend fans that really like this type of music, because if I were one of those people, I think that this one is like an 11 out of 10, but as it stands, it's really a great album. So take it as you will, but personally I don't really like this album cover. I don't think that it's a bad album cover, but it just doesn't feel like it really fits this album as being a classic album. You see, what Devin Townsend has created on here, music-wise, to me feels like something that will be remembered for a really long time. But when thinking of this album's cover, I don't really see people like, you know, glorifying it in the future as being like, you know, the perfect representation for a perfect album, because it really isn't. You know, you have those classic albums like Dark Side of the Moon with the Prism cover, or Abbey Road by the Beatles with the Crossroads and stuff like that. And it's so freaking cool. But then you have this one which contains this cover that honestly, despite being drawn probably about like a decade ago, already looks pretty much outdated, and that's not really a good sign. I like the colors on here. I like the royal purple with like the muddy rusty browns and greens of the sky and the metalish things that's going around, but the cat face itself, I don't know, it just really doesn't work out for me, at least not right now. I get why it worked back in 2010, but as it stands right now, I would really love this album cover to be changed to anything else, maybe something to do more with the color red, because it just really seems to fit right with this type of album. So all in all, this is an album to remember. While I would subjectively give this album a rating of 7, my lowest rating for something that I do believe is memorable is an 8. So yes, I'm gonna give this one a rating of 8 out of 10. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're gonna be listening to Hubardo by KO Dot. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Wan, Arist of Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page, wherever. So yeah, that's about it, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.